and I am delighted to welcome you all. It's a big time of transition. I have children and we're getting ready for school tomorrow. So many people around the Bay Area are doing that, and coming to the end of summer. And it's kind of a perfect timing for me to welcome you to today's presentation, Shifting Zeitgeist, Reflections on Forces Reshaping the Nation's Understanding of Race, with Troy Duster. I was delighted to meet Troy a year or so back when he, Russ Ellis, and Felton Henderson shared a riveting afternoon of reflection on their 60 years of friendship. My name is Andy Gaines. I'm the executive director of Ashby Village, a community-based nonprofit organization which is hosting this event. During the shelter in place, I've been deeply impressed and gratified by the depth and breadth of how our members and our volunteers have been supporting one another. So all of you out there who are participating in that, thank you and hope it's working. Stay in touch with us. And for anyone who might be interested in joining Ashby Village, we're still actively welcoming new members. So you can check out our website. We have information meetings now and again. Last month, Ashby Village celebrated our 10th anniversary. We had a 30-minute presentation that included a new film about our connections with one another, what we've accomplished, and where we're going. So if you haven't seen it, please go check out our website, ashbyvillage.org, and click on it on the homepage. And just for a tiny bit of clue, so you might want to forward about 15 minutes. There's some introductory loop as people are arriving, and there's a 30-minute presentation, so then you'll end after that. So please check it out. Ashby Village has been committed to promoting greater inclusion in the larger community and challenging institutional racism that impacts our village and the greater community. We've actually very recently hired a professional mentor who has worked in this area and is working with us on self-reflection and assessment of the values, policies, practices, and strategies of our village to be more inclusive. We treasure the socioeconomic, racial, and cultural diversity of the East Bay and want our services and programs to be accessible to a broad range of older adults. Several years ago, Ashby Village launched its It Takes a Village membership fund that provides reduced fee membership for lower income older adults who might be wanting to enjoy the vital community but not financially able to do so. Membership dues cover about 60% of the revenue needed for the organization to operate, and the balance comes from individual donors like you. So while today's event is free for everyone to attend, Ashby Village relies on donations in order for us to present programs such as this. So in the chat box, you'll probably see a link for you to give a donation on our website at all times. You can go there, but we really, really appreciate your support for helping to maintain this vital community. So I am gonna pass it on now to Joanne Carter, who's gonna share a little bit about our arts and culture program. And so delighted to have you with us today, and may it be a great journey.
Okay. Thank you, Andy, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon's presentation. I'm Joanne Carter, and I'm a member of Ashby Village and have been for the last 3 years, and also a member of the Arts and Culture Committee. Before I introduce Arlie, I want to introduce those who are on the Arts and Culture Committee and who have put in so much time for this presentation and for so many of the others that we've done over the past years. So the members are Marcia Friedman, Rochelle Lefkowitz, Betty Webster, Roberta Peressman, Elaine Hooker, Joan Cole, and Irene Marcus. I also want to thank Sue Yin Bickner, who's our project manager employed by Ashby Village, who helps us pull things together and is an absolute fabulous technical support to us. And then finally, I want to mention Sigrid, who is going to handle the chat room this afternoon, and she'll explain the details when it's her turn. And also, I want to mention that Pat Sakai will make a few comments at the conclusion of the presentation this afternoon. Now, I want to introduce Arlie. We're happy to have Arlie here to introduce her longtime friend and colleague for over the last 50 years, I understand, Troy Duster. Many of you will remember that Arlie presented her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, a New York Times bestseller at one of our series events. She was a finalist for the National Book Award, and which has recently been translated into Chinese. And I don't want to forget that it was on the New York Times bestseller list for some time. Arlie is a UC professor of sociology emerita at UC Berkeley and the author of 9 books, which include Strangers in Our Land. So welcome, Arlie.
Thank you. It is my very great pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Troy Duster. I'll highlight some of his wide-ranging contributions and honors in a moment, but let me begin by quoting from an illuminating keynote talk that Troy gave in 2007 as the Chancellor's professor of sociology. Troy's topic was race. His audience was a great many faculty and students from all 10 campuses. And his question was, how do we change the culture of the academy so as to address the needs of an ever more racially diverse state and nation? And in that talk, Troy humorously observed that a university is remarkably stodgy elephant that doesn't dance. So now the elephant Troy had in mind was UC Berkeley, the nation's premier public university. And the dance that the elephant couldn't do was to diversify its faculty and student body and to expand its body of knowledge to reflect that of the larger world around it. So Troy early on assigned himself the difficult task of dance instructor to a stodgy, obdurate university elephant. Indeed, Troy over time became a very gifted elephant whisperer. And so he would say, no, don't sit this dance out, and lift the right foot slowly up, good, and now the left foot up. Watch those tusks when you twirl. And as the elephant was in fact learning to dance, Troy went on to train generations of scholars through a new institute for the Study of Social Change. And this grew into the nation's flagship institute to train scholars of color, African American, Chicano, Latino, Asian American, Native American, men and women, PhDs in hand, who were asking new questions, writing new books, have gone on to become thought leaders and institution builders as agents of social change and composing new music for our clumsy elephant. But Troy's influence extends far beyond the academy. I counted no less than 19 professional organizations that he's worked with. And when I say worked with, I mean influenced. He was elected the president of the American Sociological Association, was wildly popular in that role. He's been the chair of the board of directors of the whole Association of American Colleges and Universities. That's a herd of elephants right there. And chair of the National Advisory Committee on Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues for the National Human Genome Project. And as we know, that is a $3 billion national program that identifies some 20,000 genes in the human DNA and has to decide enormously consequential questions about what to do with that information. Can you sell it to profit-making companies? Can police departments use it to trace down relatives of suspected criminals? Are you going to give that information to the Department of Homeland security under certain presidents. Among a bunch of eager geneticists, Troy has been one of the very few to raise socially informed ethical issues. So Troy's influence is also felt through his writing, subtle, brilliant, complex, and often prophetic. Indeed, you're reading along and you realize this isn't a book that you've got in front of you, it's a crystal ball. For example, in his now classic 1970, The Legislation of Morality, he focuses on the social definition of addiction. And he notes that when addicts are white and middle class and suburban and middle-aged and female, addiction tends to be defined as a problem of health. And it's a calls for the improving of medical care. But when addiction hits inner city, young Black men, it's defined as a problem of crime and associated with the call to expand prisons. And aren't we seeing this again? When crack, again, hits inner cities, it's perceived as a crime, but when Oxycontin hits poor whites in Appalachia, we hear talk of diseases of despair. Now, Troy's book helps us wonder, why weren't we talking about such addiction as a disease of despair back then? Again, in another book, Backdoor, Eugenics, Troy warns of a covert eugenics that may, through scientific garb, be without us noticing, apparently harmless effect of genetic screening. We have to watch this closely. Let me end on a personal note. When the phone rings in Troy's house, it could be a friend, it could be a fellow music or art lover catching him at his potter's wheel where he produces extraordinary pieces of art. But it might also be someone in need, because Troy's the person other people think to call when they're hurting. Time and again, it is a kind, humane, always unobtrusive, always modest way Troy lifts the fallen and sets them back on their feet. During a tenure struggle long ago, I experienced his help myself, and I'm largely here because of Troy. So, elephant whisperer, brilliant analyst, social forecaster, outreaching humanist, and for me, 50 years a dear friend, I give you Troy Duster.
Thank you, Ali. It's a remarkably gracious introduction. Many of you will remember when Bill Clinton tried to initiate a national conversation on race. He even put together a commission. It was headed by the distinguished historian John Hope Franklin. And the commission was like a traveling roadshow. It'd go from town to town, sometimes university, sometimes to a scene in the public where people were invited to come to meetings. And the idea was to generate this national conversation on race. Now, I wouldn't call it a failure. They actually produced a report, and they had some interesting ideas to summarize their findings. But no one would say that this commission was a success in the way that Bill Clinton had advertised it and supported it. So here's the problem. We have had many moments in this country in which we could have had a conversation about race. You'll recall when there was the nationally televised O.J. Simpson trial, and when O.J. was in the back of his car riding around. I mean, there were many moments when, for example, Anita Hill had her hearings. It was national. Everybody was tuned in to their TV sets. So we could have had a national conversation, but it didn't happen. So to my surprise, 3 months ago, I'm watching television, and it's right after the George Floyd murder. And I'm hearing something I had never heard before. It was from news anchors on mainstream media. They were saying things like, we're dealing here with systemic racism. We're dealing with structural racism. Now that happened just for a few days, but then it became a kind of common sense rendering, a linguistic turn in which the country, news reporters and then late night comedians, politicians, mayors, governors, were all talking about systemic racism. And because of the streets being completely dominated by the protesters, we had a national conversation. Now, the reason why the early Bill Clinton commission was not successful is complicated, and I don't want to go into those details, except to say that it's hard to discuss racism in the abstract. You have to tie racism to something which is like education or policing or medicine. Racism in the abstract as a concept is hard to converse about. So let me take you back to a period in which you'll see why I call this a zeitgeist change. Back in 1942, the National Opinion Research Council conducted some research on white attitudes about race. Only one third of whites in the nation at that time agreed that schools should be integrated. Only 1/2 of the white population were in favor of integrating public establishments such as restaurants, hotels, bowling alleys. That's 1942. And that date I'll come back to for other reasons. Back in the same period, the academy, universities, had courses in race relations. And the dominant textbook was by someone that was a psychologist named Gordon Allport. And the book's title tells us a lot. It was called The Nature of Prejudice. And in this framing, the problems the country was facing racially were prejudicial attitudes. The idea that the individual held or did not hold prejudicial views of the other race. And so the NORC data I just gave you was a reflection that, again, half the white population felt that there was no need to integrate hotels, restaurants. In that context, people could actually say and do the following. They could say, I'm not a racist, but you see, as an owner of the restaurant, if I invite Black people to come in, I will suffer economically because white customers just won't come. Or if I'm the owner of a bowling alley, I'm not a racist, but I just can't let people of color come in because I'll suffer. So the idea that racism was personal, prejudicial, was dominant in that period. Let me give you an example from my family. My brother Donald went to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign and got his degree in mathematics. He came back to Chicago and was hired to be a manager of a department store, Spiegel. There was one of the outlets on the near South Side, which was an all-Black community. So they wanted this Black manager, and Donald qualified. He was quite successful, and after a couple of years, he was informed that there was a job opening at Marshall Field in Chicago. Now, Marshall Field is in Chicago, would be the gold standard of the department stores, much more so than, let's say, Sears, Roebuck, or Goldblatt's. Anyway, Donald saw the opening and got an interview in his best suit and white shirt and tie. He goes down to the interview. It goes well by all accounts. And he returns home quite satisfied with his performance. He was to be told within a week what the outcome was. He got a phone call. And the person on the other end said what Donald expected, that the interview went very well. They were quite impressed. But sorry, they said, we can't have you in this role because as manager of this whole section, there'll be so many white people under you and they just won't go for it. They just won't tolerate it. In my own circumstance, I was a graduate student at UCLA, and here's a parallel account. I wanted to live near the university, and so I went to look for an apartment. After a few weeks, I finally found one that was perfect. It wasn't in Westwood, but it was close by. And it was a one-bedroom apartment above a garage in the back of an apartment building. The owner interviewed me and understood what I was doing at the university, and he said he'd be delighted to have me as a tenant. But he said, I'll call you next week and let's try to settle this. And just like in my brother's case, the phone call came and he said, well, I personally like you. I think you're okay. But I had a discussion with my wife and my family, and you know, the other tenants just wouldn't tolerate it. They wouldn't go for it. So there's the framing. Racism as individuals have this experience, and they themselves might not be prejudiced, but they couldn't afford to, quote, integrate. Okay, now something happened with the death of George Floyd, which is on everybody's agenda. Before our very eyes, this new framing, systemic racism, happened. The spirit of the times, Zeitgeist, is a German term. And in an extraordinary development, what I described earlier on, namely the Zeitgeist. It means something like the spirit of the times, the climate, the sociocultural framing in which we all experience, but sometimes are not aware of. Well, here it was. In the short space of a few weeks, Catherine Chan, an assistant researcher at UC Berkeley, took this on as her task and produced this wonderful graphic, which demonstrates to you just how right I was. Namely, that something happened in that period around George Floyd's death. You see right here? Something happened right around here. And suddenly, in the next few days, the media was completely dominated by a rendering of something called systemic racism. This is the graphic for structural, institutional, but systemic. 12,000 references in the media in that short period. So what was it? What was it? Well, let's go back to the zeitgeist of an earlier period. The United Services Organization, the USO, was formed by President Roosevelt in 1941. And as you can see here, the USO attracted the all-stars: Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, Betty Grable, Frank Sinatra, Harpo Marx, and many more. And what their task was, and they all were happy to do this, was to go and perform before the soldiers at the various bases around the country and around the world. So these are the United Services Organization. Army, Navy, at that time, Army Air Corps, the Air Force hadn't been formed yet. The Marines, United Services. Lena Horne was among those various stars. She was extremely popular, and she was both a singer and a dancer. If you go up to the USO website, what you will see is the following, is this picture, and underneath it, it will say this week, this was in 2010, when Lena Horne died at the age of 92. This week we marked the passing of an iconic singer, Lena Horne, who performed well for us and so on. Now, if that's all you heard about the Lena Horne and the USO case, you would be mightily misinformed. And now I'm going to use a term that I'll need to explain. It's called the structural anecdote. The anecdote is a well-deserved position at the low end of the totem pole of evidence. An anecdote is by its nature a single event. It has almost no capacity to be the source of generalizations. And we can just call things anecdotal and dismiss them as evidence in terms of something larger. But every now and again, the world comes across what can be called a structural anecdote. And that's one in which institutions of the society are welded together, are coordinated in ways which explain an event that is extraordinary, but if the event itself illuminates the structure of relationships. And that's why I call what I'm going to tell you now about the Lena Horne story in 1942 a structural anecdote. She's called upon, as she often does, and she goes to this camp, Robertson in Arkansas, to entertain the troops. And it's an interesting situation because it's always segregated. This is 1942. And the first audience is all white, and that's typical. She's accustomed to that. She performs, and then she's waiting for the second audience, which is going to be all black. That's the way things were in 1942. So you perform early on for an all-white audience, and then you perform for a black audience. That was okay with Lena. First performance goes well. She's well received. She goes backstage, waits for half an hour for the room to fill again. It does. She comes out and peeks through the curtains because she thinks something strange. And the whole first floor is white. She turns to her manager. She says, what's going on here? I mean, where are the blacks? And she's told that the blacks, they're up in the balcony in the back. She said, well, who are these whites on the first floor? And she's told, these are German prisoners of war. She says, what? What? In what? So she storms out. She says, I'm not performing. And she goes to the NAACP to launch a legal claim. But of course, she's up against institutional forces. She files a complaint, but she's under contract. And so the USO sanctions her for not performing and refuses to let her perform. She's banned from performing any other time for the USO. So Lena goes to her friends, she thinks, in Hollywood, the Screen Actors Guild. And she tells them what's happened and asks for their support. But they, again, almost unanimously side with the USO against her. A little side story here. One of her few defenders was Tallulah Bankhead, a Southerner. And the head of the Screen Actors Guild at the time, Dick Powell and I think June Allison were the two, of course, voted with the USO. Okay, so there's my structural anecdote. Here's the idea, that in that anecdote, you find something which really illuminates the zeitgeist, the cognitive map of the nation, that prisoners of war during wartime, during war, were given preferential treatment to Blacks. Let's go back 3 years. I want to show you a clip that only lasts 2 minutes, but it's going to help make the case about the zeitgeist and what structural anecdotes can tell us. If this works.
Don't start a business. Buy an existing business. You don't have to be a rich investor with bags full of cash.
February 20th, 1939. Just months before Hitler invades Poland and ignites the deadliest war in history, thousands of Nazis gather for a rally at an indoor arena. But this isn't Nuremberg or Berlin. This is Madison Square Garden in New York City.
You all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press.
And the man speaking isn't a member of Adolf Hitler's inner circle. He's Fritz Julius Kuhn, a U.S. citizen and head of the German-American Bund, or Association.
Kuhn wanted a rally to celebrate George Washington's birthday. The first American fascist is what they called him. They signed a contract with Madison Square Garden. Said, okay, we agree. No swastikas, no anti-Semitic signs, none of that stuff. Of course, once the contracts were signed, those agreements went out the window.
This program was produced for the German-American Bund rally.
We love him for the enemies he has made. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Fritz Kuhn.
Kuhn then went on to deliver a very, very predictable and very, very typical National Socialist stump speech about racism and the Jewish conspiracy and the communists and how everybody's an enemy and everybody has to be alike.
We, the German-American Bund, organized as American citizens with American ideals and determined to protect ourselves, our homes, our wives and children against the slimy conspirators and the parasite hand of Jewish communism in our schools, our universities, our very home.
Then, an unemployed plumber tries to silence the American fury.
Isidore Greenbaum tried to rush the stage, but these guys beat him. It looked like an SS beating in the Berlin streets. His pants were ripped off. And the audience, of course, cheered at this. To see someone beaten up, had they known he was Jewish, they would have, probably even cheered louder.
Today, many Americans are aware of the presence of neo-Nazis, who, along with other extremist fringe organizations, make headlines with their racist public demonstrations and acts of violence.
Hey, Adam. I don't know if you heard, but we just had a big development in the unfolding Spygate investigations. It's just been revealed that the Justice Department's investigation.
Okay, I need to get out of this. Exit full screen. And I want to get back to the...
This is the most unethical.
technology problems here. Let's see if we can get back to shifting zeitgeist. Okay, we're back on track. In early June of this year, it came up because of all the discussions about systemic racism. And here's how Larry Kudlow responded. He said, there's no systemic racism in the United States. This is the senior advisor to the president. So what I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes is to take you on a journey which gives substantive ideas to where racism has its systematic, structural, institutional past. Now that clip I showed you was from 1939. During the Roosevelt administration, they erected the Federal Housing Authority and gave loans to hundreds of thousands and then millions of Americans. But they had guidelines. And here's the guideline to which I wish you would pay particular attention. Here's the language. It's a quotation from the manual. If a neighborhood is to retain its stability, it shall be occupied by the same social and racial classes. Discrimination against Negroes was a condition of federal assistance. The Code of Ethics of the National Association of Real Estate Boards not only barred its members from selling houses across the racial divide, and now here's the kicker. The brochure of 1943 outlined the grounds for expulsion of realtors who violated race-based sales. Now let's give that some thought. Remember I said that in this period, there was the idea that you didn't need to be a racist, but if you owned a restaurant, you didn't want to lose customers. Well, here's the question, here's the issue even further. If you were a realtor and you, quote, were not a racist, you didn't want to say not just lose this client or the people around you, but here was you could lose your license. Let's let that sink in. This is institutional, structural, and systemic, and its consequences are going to be dramatic, and I'm going to show you the direct connection to systemic housing today. For the next 30 years, whites got housing loans at 3 to 5%. And here in California, indeed, in Northern California, in that 14-year period after the war, 350,000 new homes were built for whites. 100 went to blacks. And this is the basis, the primary basis of total net worth, the relevance of which I'm going to come to shortly. It was true for Northern California. It was true for the whole country. 11 million homes were built with federal assistance. But because of the Federal Housing Authority's manuals, you couldn't rent many of those. You couldn't provide housing support or loans to blacks. Here's the story about 2020. You can do the math, about 10 times greater. And the central focus and the source of that median net worth is housing, property. And now here's a short journey I'm going to take you on through my hometown, Chicago. But not 1949, not 1939. No, this is 2012 to 2018. nearly 170,000 loans. And the banks in Chicago had $57 billion in loans. Condominia, single-family dwellings, apartment buildings, $57 billion. 7 and 10 of those dollars went to majority white neighborhoods, 8% to black neighborhoods, 9% to Latino. What's interesting is that in this graphic, it tells you exactly how the distribution went. However, the important point is the ratios. And here's the ratio. Now, whites in Chicago are now about the same proportion of the population as blacks. We're not talking about 1939. We're talking about the last 8 to 10 years. So not just this, you see the systemic character of the loanings, but how it seals into its very core, the whole nature of net worth and neighborhoods. Now, you probably understood that when I mentioned Lena Horne and the structural anecdote, I was going to get to George Floyd. What was it? We all saw the video death. It was excruciating to watch. But what was it about the George Floyd video? What structural forces were revealed that this is no longer a rogue cop? This was suddenly talked about every day in the media as systemic and structural. Why? Well, for starters, look at the medical examiner's report. What it said was, Mr. Floyd died of an underlying condition. No, not of asphyxiation. Even as the full nation in a pandemic, therefore locked up, watched over and over again Officer Chauvin kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes while onlookers pleaded. Now I want to give you a couple of images here which tie these things together and turn this into a structural anecdote. In a very short period thereafter, Carlos Ingham Lopez, policeman sitting on his neck, gasped for breath. He died. The examiner for the police said he died of an underlying condition, not of asphyxiation. And suddenly people are starting to put together a pattern. They're starting to say, wait a minute, we saw with our own eyes what happened. Now some specific context for the George Floyd murder. This appeared in June 2020. They go back and look at the whole structure of policing in Minneapolis, and they find that Black people are 7 times more likely to be the subject of police violence. And I'd like you to now engage in a thought experiment, a mental exercise. And I guarantee you will fail. Why? Well, okay, I just read a book in the last few weeks called Dark Towers. It's about banking fraud, about Deutsche Bank and the last 20 to 30 years of how that bank is engaged in all kinds of scurrilous banking practices. I mean, skirting the international laws about banking to criminals and mafioso and rogue regimes and dictators and so on. All of that was going on. And of course, a lot of insider trading. Now imagine in Minneapolis, you have the Black community and you have most of the white community. And it's also probably an area called the financial district. And in the financial district, let's say someone is suspected, accused of insider trading, pocketing oh, let's say $20,000. Now, George Floyd, $20 counterfeit bill? Can we imagine the officer, Chauvin, going to the insider trading part of town, accosting this insider trader and then placing him under arrest, kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes while onlookers pleaded? Now that's the important point of a structural anecdote. Onlookers watching Officer Chauvin, pleading with him not to kill this white insider, and Officer Chauvin ignoring them. It is inconceivable. Quite the opposite. What's happening here? If you go online, look under Killology. There's a very popular police trainer who goes around the country and gives these lectures to police departments. He has bookings every year, often exceeding 200. Many police departments take his services. And part of the instruction is, if one does not have the temperament or mental stamina to kill, then find another kind of employment. The year before the George Floyd killing, the mayor tried to defund this kind of police training, but the police union fought back and a compromise was reached. The compromise? The city wouldn't have to pay. There's structural institutional relationships in this tale. The George Floyd killing is a structural anecdote. I showed this before, but I want to show it again and then lead you into some implications of it. The backdrop is systemic loans by banks. Wealth accumulation based upon property is at the source of this. In 1986, we began something called a national training program for local police during the Reagan administration. 27,000 law officers in almost every state in the union were trained with Operation Pipeline. What my colleague Harry Levine, who studied this very closely, is called Head Start for Prison. Officers were briefed on how to spot vehicles likely to be transporting drugs, and these were mainly in Latino and African American communities. Here in California, our own records show that between 80 to 90% of all motorists have been minorities, only 10% white. Now, in the Supreme Court decision in 1996, they confirmed that it's permissible to stop any suspicious looking motorist for any reason if it's a traffic offense. Well, here, some of you will be surprised to hear what this might look like. Lane straddling, hanging an item on your rearview mirror, unfastened seatbelt, or a tinted window that the officer finds excessive, and driving below the speed limit. With these tools in mind, here's this famous study out of Maryland. And I'll have to go through this with a little bit of tediousness, but you'll see why I'm doing it when you get to the concept of systemic racism. Okay, so here we have number of observers. 4,300 whites were observed. 4,000 of them committed some kind of violation. That is, almost everybody could be stopped. Blacks, 973, observed. 938 could have been stopped, and so on. But here's the rub. Of the observed whites, 76%, 74% did some violation. Only 19% were stopped. Quite the opposite. 70% of blacks were observed, 18% they said had some kind of violation, but 73% were stopped. Here's some extraordinary systemic data. Most of you have a sense of this, but let me just put it out there. In every age group, whites consume more marijuana than blacks and Latinos in every age group. Lifetime marijuana use broken down by age. And for this graphic, step back, don't worry about the details. I want to give you the big picture. The big picture is this. The black bar is percent of blacks in the population. The red bar is those who got arrested, percent of those arrested. So this is national. This is Atlanta, Baltimore, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and so on and so on. In other words, this is Operation Pipeline, empirically sustained. Similarly, stop and frisk, New York City. You've all heard of these figures. I'll go through them very quickly because I want to come to my conclusion. Of all those who were stopped, half were black. Latinos. And the stop and frisk situation in New York. Let me just give you a quick image for those of you who know New York City. If you live below 95th Street on the east side, that's called the Silk Stocking District. The data are in. Almost no one is stopped and frisked in that district. Above 95th on the east side, Spanish Harlem. The rate of stop and frisk is up to about 60%. That is systemic, and here's what I mean. Officer Chauvin, acting one way, if he were in New York City, above 95th Street, would tip his hat and say hello and be friendly below 95th Street. And I tell you this because it has to do with the whole notion of rogue cops, of racist cops. You recall I began with the imagery of, I'm not a racist. People around me may be, I have to deal with them. Well, with rogue cops, it's a different framework. It's not as though they're rogue cops, it's that there are rogue circumstances, situations. The officer who does this below 95th Street is the rare officer. But that same officer above 95th, the same officer, can be a rogue cop. Part of what needs to come next is the idea that when you have an analysis of systemic racism, you're suddenly in an interesting situation. That is, you have to now talk about a systemic solution. You can't just say, I understand that it's a systemic problem, and then have issues coming forward which have very little to do with the systemic amelioration. So here's a quick running through of the qualified immunity. Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, the right to sue officials who violate your constitutions, the constitutional rights. Supreme Court ruled that anyone could be sued. And this was one of the last times it was used in the direction of justice and truth and beauty. Supreme Court 67 invented the idea of qualified immunity. This idea is not going back all the way to 1871, but the basis of it was the reformulation in 1967, where they invented the concept that if an official operated in good faith, then they could not be sued. Even if that wasn't enough. The court then ruled that it doesn't matter if the officer acted in good faith, but rather was a clearly established right which was violated. And that can almost never be the case. So if you want to have a systemic solution to policing, you'd have to start with something which talked about the whole framework of qualified immunity. Democratic House bill passed last June. As you might have suspected, it can't get past the Senate. People have talked about defunding the police. And my view is the title is unfortunate. It makes it vulnerable to caricature. Better to have something which you can't put in a single phrase, but have a better understanding of what's involved. So for me, it should be restructure police funding. Defunding stop and frisk. More funding for cold case rape kits. Across the country, there are thousands of rape kits. They're just filed away. No capacity, at least given funding levels for this idea, to match them to DNA databases. So you want structural systemic solutions to what you call a structural systemic problem. We have to find a way to reframe the problem. Now, symbols and substance. I'm in favor of changing symbols. I'm not opposed to it, but it can easily become a substitute. The National Football League has decided symbolically to play the Negro national anthem at the opening of certain games. People are kneeling. 32 teams, 2 black general managers. Aunt Jemima changes the name. NASCAR, the Confederate flags are down. Dixie Chicks are now just the Chicks, and so forth and so on. We could go on. But the title is Systemic Racism. How about this thing in medicine? Last week, Michigan Governor Whitmer declared systemic racism as a public health emergency. The solution was mandating implicit bias training. I'm not opposed to that. I just think it doesn't deal with the question, the systemic basis. I'm going to end with some imagery here. Richard Pryor has a clip of himself in an exchange with Jim Brown. And Pryor is flailing away about his circumstance, about his problems. And at various moments, Jim Brown says, "What you going to do?" And it goes on like that, 3 or 4 times. Pryor flails away, he's flailing. At every point he's stopped, and Jim Brown says, okay, what you going to do? If racism is systemic, what are we going to do? I began with a structural anecdote. I'm going to end with an allegory by Leo Tolstoy. What Tolstoy did, he said in this allegory, horse and carriage, the owner of the carriage and his servant in front, horse and buggy. It's a very hot day on the way between St. Petersburg and some small town. The horse stumbles and breaks, and the horse can't go on. So the owner gets on the back of his subject and carries him. The subject carries the owner on this hot, dusty road. And the owner keeps saying, I know it's a burden, but you know, we've got to get where we're going. I can help you. I can wipe your brow. I can take off, I can either unburden myself of some of the weight. I can do any of a number of things, but I won't get off your back. That's Tolstoy. We would need for the US to understand the problem of housing and net worth, a Marshall Plan. At the end of the war, World War II, the US put billions of support into Western Europe. But you saw what we did when it comes to housing here. We would need to put trillions in today's translation to begin to deal with the systemic solution to a systemic problem. I end with this imagery. It is not photoshopped. This is an actual picture of a Siamese woman carrying a European man on her back in 1905. Literally. She's carrying this man. This is a woman. So, the rhetorical question, again, now that we've reached that point, what you going to do? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Troy Duster, for this really insightful and informative talk. And I assume there will be quite a few questions. In fact, we already have a few, and I might start here. This is from one of from the audience, and he or she says, please compare the tenor of the times and country to the situation when you came to Berkeley. You were one of my first sociology instructors in 1967-68, even though the rhetoric has changed some, but differences both in theory and practice on the street level at least, have you seen, do you see, do you anticipate, expect over the next 10 to 20 years?
And a few short sentences. Huh? Well, okay, let me just say this. When I came to Berkeley in 1965, actually, in the summer, and then joined the faculty in 67 on a permanent basis, I was one of 6 Blacks on a faculty of 1,350. I was the only Black in the social sciences. My colleagues were in natural resources or in the law school. There was Wilkins and so on. So one of the things that was pretty clear was that, that there was no collective notion of involvement by the university in change. All that would erupt violently in the late 60s, early 70s, and things changed dramatically. So by the time I left the university, 35, 40 years later, we have a substantial number of not just Black faculty, Asian faculty, Latino faculty. So there has been an extraordinary shift and change just in terms of that period in which I was one of 6. I would now be one of about 75 across the various categories. The question also asks for mood and then future. What to say about the mood? Berkeley has gone through a real transformation of gentrification in the last 40 years. So there was a rather substantial Black community down by Sacramento. Housing costs have skyrocketed. And as everybody knows, housing costs here are such that you can't get even young white faculty to come in and buy a house in Berkeley because of the situation. So the mood for the next period is that we're not going to see much in terms of change unless we have a dramatic shift in the capacity to put funding into the universities. I don't know what to say, except let me just say this. In the early 1970s, California had 9 campuses. 30 years later, we had 9 campuses. 40 years later, we had the 10th campus, Merced. 1970, we had 12 prisons. 30 years later, we had 34 prisons. The amount of the state budget went to prisons versus university, not just triple, quadruple, but exceeds what was once like a 5-to-1 ratio. State money to higher education versus prisons. The prison structures zoomed up in that 30-year period. And prison funding exceeds university funding now.
Well, there's another question actually from the same person, and she says, Troy, please comment on the work, especially the classroom teaching of Leon Litwack. Is he still alive, teaching, and on campus?
I don't know whether Leon, I haven't seen Leon in at least 4 or 5 years, but he retired from teaching, and he was, again, among the favorite of colleagues. Historian who told it like it was in extraordinary truth-telling books. Leon, for example, give an example of what he did. There was a book on lynching and a lot of pictures of extraordinary details. I mean, just terrible details about these lynching parties or these places. It would have these families come to these lynchings and they'd have picnics in the park. And Leon wrote this remarkable account of what it would mean, talking about the zeitgeist, to have your children come to a lynching. What would it mean for the culture to have your children come to a lynching? So Leon, I hope he's still with us. I haven't seen him for several years, but he was a wonderful historian.
So here's a question from someone from Marin County, and she says, or he says, here in Marin County, the results of systemic racism are baked into existing housing, school, and employment patterns. What steps should citizens require the town and county to take to reverse these realities?
Well, that is, of course, the sentient observation and question. What's to be done when we have embedded and entrenched structures, the housing difference, the housing figures I showed you, the bank loans, they haven't inverted, they've increased the differences. So the bank loans from Chicago I showed you were from 2012 to 2018. So he's right, it's deeply embedded. The question is, what can you do? You can try to find ways to support politicians who are willing to talk about structural, systemic changes in banking behavior. Not just this current circumstance of just support the banks, but put teeth into the banking situation. And that's where Elizabeth Warren had it right. And of course, she was attacked viciously, and Wall Street sort of hates her. But there would be a way in which you could get the banks to change their behavior, and it would begin. It would not be as effective completely, but it would begin to reverse what I just talked about the last 75, 80 years of federal housing processes and the way in which realtors have been able to do this. So the answer is banks, banks, banks.
So Julie has the following question. What would you put on the list of things to do in response to the what you gonna do question?
I want that for the audience. That is, it is so easy, isn't it, to have the symbolic changes? It's easy to say that you're in favor of pulling down statues and pulling on flags. The hard questions are, what are the points of entry to a systemic change? And that's no easy answer. I don't come to this topic with the idea that there are easy answers. I just think it should be the national conversation. And a lot of good minds are out there, and they can take on and tackle this problem. I mean, I can tell you what I would think about racism in one institution called the university or the National Football League. I mean, my colleague and friend for many years, Harry Edwards, has been doing this for the last 50 years. I could say, okay, we have this, I think as Harry put it 50 years ago, this plantation system of the National Football League. The owners are billionaires. Same with the National Basketball Association, billionaire owners. And these players are on the field and they're making millions. And people are saying, what's the problem? You especially you black people, you're making millions of dollars. Well, that's to misunderstand the whole structure of what's going on. And if you wanted to change things, and it's going to happen, by the way, in the next 15, 20 years, the revolt of the athletes is happening before our eyes. It's happening in the colleges. It's going to be happening soon at the national level. And that's where we're going to see change, because these are billion-dollar enterprises. If anybody thinks that's overstatement of the problem, look at the debates around college football right now. I once had a colleague who said to me, he was a provost at the University of Pittsburgh. He said, Duster, on one Saturday afternoon, CBS comes in and records the football team playing. He said, I can fund the library for the next 4 years. Not what you got to say about that, okay? So the universities are sometimes caught. They've decided to spend all of this money on athletics and sports. There are these black players often in football, sometimes in basketball, and so on. They are paid not one penny. They can't be paid. And now that the pandemic has hit, the universities which have relied upon this are starting to have a real problem. How are they going to force these players back onto the field or back onto the basketball court? It's a current problem, and it's going to magnify in the next short period.
So I have two questions here. One, they all deal with reparations. One is, can you please define reparations and suggest a course of action for it? What is a start and what is enough?
No, the answer is no. I don't think reparations is the kind of solution, because it's too broadly framed. We should have a series of specific initiatives aimed at systemic structures. And that's why I went first to the banks and to housing. I would then go to education and talk about the ways in which universities are now charging far too much money for tuition, and far less is coming from the state. In the golden era of higher education, 1949 to 1971, in the golden era, state budgets funded higher education. That could happen again, but it takes resolve. It takes institutional structures which are put in place after our new conversation about race. So the answer for me is not, quote, reparations, but rather specific, pointed, structural what we call them, insurgencies into the population's wealth or lack of it, around housing, around medicines. We need to get rid of this whole structure of medication where it's the private sector that's making money off people being sick. I think just a half an hour of watching that early film by Michael Moore is the beginning to the answer to that question. He talks about how other countries, Sweden, France, all over Europe, people pay high taxes, but the state handles their medical care. Reparations, what would that look like? Going to particular persons? I don't think that's a good idea. I think, we have the situation with, I forget when it was, in the 1990s, when the Japanese who were descendants of those who were in the camps got $40,000, something like that, dollars, reparations. That doesn't really transform anything. And it helps those who got the money. It doesn't change the systemic character of what happens in the community. So I would suggest that rather than reparations, what I talked about earlier, a German Marshall Fund, trillions of dollars into structuring and restructuring our inner cities. That would help all communities.
So the next question comes from Jeannie, and she wants to know, how do you explain the disparity between the success of other minorities, like the Chinese and Japanese, as opposed to that of the Black population? All the groups were poor, despised at times for various reasons, yet they differ significantly in their asset accumulation.
That is a longer answer than I'm going to be able to provide here, but let me just give you the beginnings of an answer and ask the questioner to pursue some lines of inquiry which might provide an answer. You have to understand the history of migration across this country. And let's take Hawaii. Blacks were brought here as slaves, and their labor was free. They were not permitted to own housing, not permitted to learn the language. If you taught a Black to read, you were punished. I don't think that's true for the history of migration of the Japanese or the Chinese. And actually, I know about those two migrations. They come primarily to Hawaii and to California. And they were permitted to read and write. Indeed, part of the migration from those countries is not the poorest of the poor. You can't even imagine getting on a boat if you're the poorest of the poor. So the migration, I would suggest that the questioner look at the history of migration of Chinese, then Japanese, and Filipinos into Hawaii. And he or she will get an education on what the difference was of slave migration patterns, slave migration into the South. Take a look at those two histories, China, Japan, Philippines into Hawaii and California. And then look at the contrasting migration of Black slaves into the South during slavery. And I think the answer will come from just a surface reading of that history.
Marsha wants to know, do you think there's any value to a truth or reconciliation process of any sort? And if so, what sort of process?
Again, I don't think simply having a commission again, that's what we started with Bill Clinton, remember? That was an attempt at some level to have this kind of an idea fomenting in the country. I don't think truth and reconciliation, unless it's tied to initiatives that penetrate the structural inequities, are going to be effective. Truth and reconciliation in South Africa, it was so different because, first of all, Blacks in South Africa were over 70% of the population. Whites were the minority. And so there was a need to have a reconciliation because Blacks would take power, and the idea that they might be as cruel to the whites as whites had been to them. Therefore, reconciliation. Whites wanted reconciliation. The US is quite the opposite. Blacks are 13% of the population. There is no danger that there will be, well, except for the last 5 years, a real shift in power where Blacks have the potential, as in South Africa, to completely dominate the white population. So truth and reconciliation in South Africa had extremely important historical reasons. Domination was a possibility by the Black population. Reconciliation was a good thing for whites. The United States doesn't have that same restriction. Blacks are only 13%. And given figures which I can't get into right here, but if I could, I'll give you a picture of what's happened over the last 75 years as Blacks have gotten more and more power in the Democratic Party, and whites have moved out of the party. Reconciliation, I don't know. We're probably getting on toward the last part of this, but continue.
Yeah, so I have actually lots of questions here. So now comes one question, and I'm sure a lot of people are interested in your answer. Your take on Kamala Harris.
My take on Kamala Harris. I'm glad that she's on the ticket. I think that what will happen is that she will be an advantage. And at that level, I have to say, good. Looking at the full range of other candidates who were considered, my own preference would have been for someone who had, like Elizabeth Warren, or even Karen Bass, or others that I could name, a more progressive history, a more progressive take. But having said that, I'm glad that he picked her. It's fine. I think that she'll be the right kind of foil. And that's what we need right now, an effective foil. She'll be more effective than any other possible vice president to counter Donald Trump and Mike Pence. That's my take.
Could you comment on the recent book on New York Times bestseller list, whose thesis is that America has a social caste system?
Yes, this is Isabel Wilkerson's new book. She wrote a wonderful essay about a month ago in the New York Times, and I thought it was superb. Here's the problem she's going to run into. By using caste as a way of thinking about the American system, she's going to run up against a lot of scholars who take the position that caste was too specific to India and that you will not learn more by applying it to the United States. I think that's wrong-headed. I think Wilkerson is trying to illuminate the problem of structural relationships between blacks and whites. And that in so doing, if she can extract from the caste system insights, cognitive mapping that lets us understand in new ways what's happening, then I think she's made a contribution. My reading of her essay was that she's done a wonderful job of bringing together insights from the caste system and turning it into something which can be a complement to racial stratification. I have the same response, for example, to what's happened with the race and class debate. People have, there's a new controversy on the East Coast where Adolph Reed has been told he can't come to a meeting because he's much more of the class analyst than the race analyst. I say it's class and race and caste. We want to have an understanding of the situation. We shouldn't take the view that caste should be cast out. We should be looking for insights we can garner from the kind of work that Wilkerson is doing. So I'm a strong proponent of her work. I think she's a wonderful writer and analyst.
So Peter Sussman has a comment. He says, before you give this talk again, please add a slide of Trump's quote on the threat to the suburbs.
Actually, I had that in it, but I took it out.
Yeah.
It's a reconstruction of the 1940s. As most of you know, Trump's father was the owner of this apartment complex, a series of tenement buildings, and would not rent to blacks. And we had sued, and they had to pay lots of damages because of it. But yes, Peter Sussman is correct. I just had so many slides.
And yeah, the next two comments actually, I think have to do both with Leon Litwack. Yeah, the second definitely. He was living in Santa Barbara, and I hope he's still with us, was one comment. And the other one, Leon Litwack is still alive according to Wikipedia, and he is 91.
Yes,
so
good.
As information. And okay, so the next question, where are the soft points for structural change in public policy today? Finance, fire, housing, healthcare, minimum livable wage. How do we find the most likely pressure points?
Healthcare. I think the pandemic has fed into the shifting zeitgeist, the spirit and climate of the times. People now understand that they didn't understand before, that when you have healthcare insurance tied into your employment, and then employment is massive, you have a healthcare problem that is a public health problem. That's the massive introduction that's possible now. Wasn't possible 8 months ago. But now a lot of people are going to be hurting because of this pandemic, because of the unemployment, because of the unemployment tied to insurance. You can't get your medicine because you're not employed. You're going to be, because of the pandemic, probably evicted. And then no access to health care because when you go to the hospital, they want to see your Medicare card or your Medicare, and you don't have one. That's a point of extraordinary vulnerability for the society. And it's not being taken as seriously as it should be. The pandemic has also shifted the zeitgeist.
There's one question about Lena Horne. Did the Lena Horne anecdote gain public attention in 1942 and lead to any changes at the time?
It was covered up. I showed you that slide from the USO website, and it said that Lena Horne, we really regret her passing. She was a good contributor to the USO, and that was it. No. Except for the account I gave, which is from her daughter's book. I think it's 1996, somewhere in there. You can hardly find a reference to it. The USA doesn't talk about it. Lena didn't talk about it very much, but her sister gave great and exquisite detail about what happened when she went to Hollywood to talk to her friends about getting her support. And they turned their backs and said, USO was right, you should have gone out there and performed. Before prisoners of war, during a war.
Yeah. So Irene wants to know, are you in favor of voting yes on Prop 15? And if passed, it would correct the unintended consequences that have allowed 12 billion for schools and communities.
Let me hear that first part again. The proposition?
15.
And the content of the proposition is?
If passed, it would correct the unintended consequences that have allowed me 12 billion for schools and communities.
I don't have enough information to make an informed comment.
Okay. Good, and there is, do consider the institution of public banking as a potential remedy to the reluctance of banks to grant loans to Blacks?
Yes, emphatically yes. Banking can and should be at least one massive alternative to the current system, public. Yes.
So you don't like the term defund the police force. Could you talk a bit more about how you would improve the policing function?
I think I put in one of the slides the language, restructure police funding, which means to assign police activity to certain kinds of problems. And I used an example, the rape kits. That's one example, but if I went through various departments, I'd have different kinds of advice. For example, in some jurisdictions, there wouldn't be much of a problem of policing around, let's say, what should we call it, drugs, let's say drugs. In other parts of the city, other parts of the country, there might be a larger issue. So I don't have a global position on restructuring. I think that should be done by progressives in various communities as they make an assessment of where they think the police should be spending much more of their energy and time. But I don't like the idea because defund has this caricature and it makes people like, Pence and Trump sound reasonable, and that's hard to take.
So before I ask you the next question, because I still have 37 messages here, most of them probably questions, how many more are you up for? So,
not very many, but go ahead.
Okay. So instead of depending on developers to build affordable housing for a profit, can we build public housing that is good to live in? How to develop the public will care for all people?
I think there are both strategies are useful. I think public housing is of course, a good idea under certain circumstances. But again, it depends upon how that public housing is structured, created, who's behind it. Is it public housing because it's a partnership with the private sector? Well, that's possible, but I'd like to give the public housing more authority. But that's a difficult situation. I mean, in Chicago, there was a public housing project, which was actually named for my grandmother. And in the first 30 years, it was an extraordinarily successful project. People loved going there. It was single family dwellings, sometimes duplexes, gardens everywhere. But then somewhere in the 1980s, it took a downturn and it became a drug infested place. And it was so bad that it had to be closed. Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago, very similar. I mean, it was what's called a vertical slum. So one should not be in favor of public housing per se, public housing with a particular kind of structure, control, monitoring, assessment, and so forth. So public housing, yes, but carefully planned and carefully monitored. You know, we're getting out of my range here. I mean, I'm not really an expert on public housing, but continue. I'll try.
Okay, you let me know when you had enough. So and then
how about we take just randomly 3 more?
3 more. Okay. So I have one question here from Veronica. She wants to know: can you talk a bit about generational trauma?
Whoa. I can, but I don't think with much insight. I think one of the great books on this topic is by Karl Mannheim, and it's about how different generations have different understandings of the world, and how that becomes an issue for each generation. He does it with a lot of insight and a lot of knowledge and a lot of empirical work. I think that's how we should begin this conversation about generational conflict. Generations, I mean, this generation currently, what can be said? They have a totally different experience of the world than the previous generation. And what that means is an empirical question. And that, I think, is what Mannheim was trying to point to. We can't just say generational conflict, generational differences. We have to look at these as different experiences of the world. And if you were brought up in the Great Depression, as my uncles were, and then I was brought up during, the post-Depression, my generation had a hard time understanding the Great Depression. We thought it was, what are they talking about? It's way back then. Well, now I experience it. I talk to people about the 60s, and it's like me talking to my uncles about the Great Depression. They have no understanding of what it was like. So what is my responsibility and what is the responsibility of generations to communicate? I don't have a good answer to that question, but I do think I can point to Karl Mannheim, who wrote a book on generational conflict.
So the next question is actually from Andra Lichtenstein, and I think this is a good question to kind of like put a stop on the question and answering section. She says, Ashby Village is embarking on a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. What can we do, other small organizations do, to make change that will impact structural racism as opposed to ornamental change?
Fairly basic question, and I think I should thank the person for bringing it up, not because I have an answer, but because I think that is the right question. I think it's true for every organization now to take seriously the question about how it functions, what its organizational structure is, and how it can enhance its own diversity. The first question has to do with finances. I mean, it's very good to have these calls to action, but you're going to need outreach. And outreach often requires people to make contributions. Ashby Village has probably a relatively high income group that could make contributions. And they could even, what's it called? There's a point at which we make a contribution, you specify how it can be spent. I think one way of increasing the diversity is to have pointed, specified contributions from as many members who will do this, and then outreach to communities in the vicinity where you increase the diversity.
Thank you very much, Troy Duster, for this really amazing talk and for all the time that you gave us now with the question and answering. And yeah, and for the final comments, I actually give it now to Pat.
Thank you. I'm Pat Sakai. I'm a founding member of Ashby Village and a member of the Ashby Village Board of Directors. Wow. I don't know about you, but this talk is going to give me a lot to think about. Our deepest gratitude to you, Troy, for sharing your perspective on a topic in which we are all deeply invested. I hope Professor Duster's presentation and the ensuing Q&A discussion have been stimulating for all of you and will help spark deep reflection and exchange within the Ashby Village community. I know in our neighborhood group, the Outlandish group, plans to undertake the beginning of such a discussion this coming week. If you've been moved today and appreciate Ashby Village for presenting thoughtful and provocative forums like this one, and if you'd like to support greater equity and inclusion of low-income members of Ashby Village who are much in need of our services, then we invite you to go to ashbyvillage.org to show your appreciation by donating. And thank you for that shout out, Troy. Finally, more exciting events planned. This coming Tuesday, August 18th, a special interest group of Ashby Village, Elder Action, will present Yes on Prop 15, how villagers like us can empower elders to speak up when Prop 15 foes try to scare us. Elder Action has a saying, we're old enough to know better. We also hope to see you at our next forum featuring Fiona Ma, California State Treasurer, on Sunday, September 13th, so just in about a month. And she will speak about California's Master Plan on Aging, including a key idea of interest to, I'm sure, many of us, state-funded long-term care. And lastly, a very special Ashby Village's Special Election Information 2020 event featuring Robert Reich on this topic, why no one should take a Biden victory for granted. That's going to be Tuesday, September 22nd. So detailed information on all of these events can be found at ashbyvillage.org. So once again, many, many thanks to you, Troy, and for all of you who joined us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks.